Greetings, everyone. Welcome back. This is another attempt. My PowerPoint app is not working with audio or video, so let's try it this way. This is chapter 2, entitled The Structure of Art, and this is part 2, The Principles of Design. So as a reminder from part 1, after completing this chapter, you should be able to distinguish between various materials, processes, and methods in the production of art objects, identify the characteristics of different art forms and distinguish one from another, explain the roles of elements and principles of design in creating forms and compositions. And it's this latter, the third bullet point, that we're going to be working on in this video. So the principles of design include unity, variety, scale, proportion, balance, emphasis, subordination, movement, and rhythm and repetition. It's a little confusing with these slashes between some of the words, but they're really combined concepts. So unity goes with variety, for instance. So you don't have to separate these and talk about them separately. They're really a kind of combination where one works in in cooperation with the other, shall we say. So remember from last time I talked about baking ingredients as these kind of raw materials that you need in order to make something, but they're just things, they're not processes really. So what we're talking about now with the principles of design is processes. So in order to get baguettes, that was the example I used, we needed the raw ingredients from the previous slide. But it's really the arrangement of these things into baguettes, or in the case of art, that's the principle of design to get the finished product. Now, key terms, we've got composition, which is the overall arrangement of the picture or work of art, painting, sculpture, say. And then unity and variety are both visual and conceptual, and we'll talk about all these things. We have scale and proportion, and we'll talk a little bit about hierarchical scale. That's where objects that are larger are considered to be more important in the composition. Balance is visual weight, symmetry, and asymmetry. So in other words, it's not just balance, but it's things that are out of balance in an appropriate way. Emphasis, subordination, and movement have to do with focal point, what draws your eye to a certain part of the painting or the image, and what maybe keeps your eye just quiet in another part of an image, of the image. And then we have rhythm and repetition, visual repetition and patterns. And recall from last time, part 1 of chapter 2, that pattern was included as one of the elements of design or visual elements in that lecture. And it's a little confusing because in a sense, a pattern is a process of repetition. So don't be too confused, but note that there's some overlap between the visual elements visual elements or elements of design and the principles of design. They're not there's no clear-cut separation necessarily between the two because they really work together in order to create a composition. So a composition is the organization of all the visual elements within a work of art. Artists design their compositions using guidelines known as the principles of design. Unity and variety is the first one. Unity is a sense of oneness, things belonging together, and a kind of overall coherence. Variety is differences that provide interest and contrast, and it's hard to separate these two, as you'll probably notice here. One needs the other in order to work properly. So Matisse's Memory of Oceana, notice that a unifying element, I would say, is the white background, that kind of sweep of a wave or whatever that form, abstract form, might have been in the artist's mind. But there's a kind of coherence, unity of the design because of certain repeated elements in the background. So there's the white that unifies the design. There's also the repeating use of the blues, say, in the background that also unify the design. But then we have various, differences that make the composition quite interesting, with repetitions of certain colors in various places that lead our eye around, creating, and through this variety, it creates a sense of motion. So unity and variety, we have both visual unity based on using the visual elements that as we saw in the Matisse painting. Is it a painting? Sorry, it's more of a collage. And then we have conceptual unity created through tying a group of ideas together. So here's an example, and it's sort of a combination of both. Annette Messenger's Mes Yeux, I think I've pronounced that right. And we have both a kind of visual unity because of the framed photographs, but there's also a conceptual unity because of the handwritten text of a very personal nature. So there's both visual and conceptual. Scale and proportion are next. Both have to do with size. And I should mention here that these, there shouldn't really be a slash between scale and proportion. They are two different concepts. So I guess I have to backtrack a little bit and say it's not true that the principles of design always include an inherent opposition necessarily. So scale doesn't have to be contrasted with proportion, and we'll see that. But there is something very interesting of things being a peculiar scale and things being out of proportion that make them both visually interesting. Now, this is a little confusing. Scale is size in relation to a constant or normal size. And then proportion refers to size relationships between parts of a whole or between two or more items perceived as a unit. So it's a kind of contrast within something that's supposed to be of a certain arrangement in order to be in proper proportion, and yet these things might be skewed. And I've got some examples here. So here's an example of scale. Plantoir by Klaus Oldenburg and Cosi van Bruggen, his wife. Plantoir means trowel in French. So you have a giant trowel, 23 feet high in this garden. So obviously the scale is way off. It's out of scale from what a normal trowel would be, say 8 inches long or so. And this one is giant. So I think the visual interest comes from a kind of the comedic aspect, right, of the trowel being too large for the situation that it's in. And then here's an example of proportion, or maybe we should say out of proportion, where the woman's body is out of proportion with itself as each part nests within the lower part. So this is a proportion where the elements just don't go properly together. So actually, I'm sorry, I should say out of proportion. So just a little side note here. The golden section is a proportional ratio used by artists and the ancient Greeks in both architecture and other works of art. So there are these mathematical formulas. I won't get into that since I'm pretty bad at math. But were and are ways of creating compositions that are visually pleasing based on mathematical formulas. So balance, we have visual weight, referring to an apparent heaviness or lightness of forms arranged in the composition, and maybe their juxtaposition with each other. When visual weight is equally distributed to either side of the implied center of gravity, a composition is felt to be visually balanced. So like a scale, balanced in the middle with equal weights on either side, is balanced visually. Now here's Noguchi's red cube. Yeah, pretty well balanced. Of course, I think the the thrill of this piece is that it seems like it might fall over, but it is visually and probably physically balanced too, in order to be able to stand up like that. No doubt it's anchored in the ground too. So we have symmetrical balance, mirror image of shapes and forms on either side of an imaginary line vertically or horizontally through the middle. And these elements would correspond to each other. They'd be similar in shape, size, and placement. Relieved or approximate symmetry is slight differences between these axial areas of a work of art for visual interest. And asymmetrical balance, as you might imagine, is two sides that really don't balance each other out in a normal way, but they might do so visually, and we'll talk about that. So Klimt's Death and Life, notice we have a reasonable balance of the light and dark areas, but I would say the light area of life is much heavier or dense, shall we say, visually, whereas death and this kind of background of muted colors is less dense, but visually it balances out the other side because of the weight that it has optically. So let's move on to emphasis and subordination and movement. Emphasis and subordination are complementary concepts. Emphasis, the viewer's attention is centered more on certain parts of a composition than on others, creating a kind of focal point, which is our next term here, the specific spot generally to which our attention is drawn, and subordination, a less visually interesting area. So obviously in the preceding example, we have the Klimt painting where the background behind death is quite muted and dull. It's meant to give our eye a visual rest, I would say. And then Goya's Executions of the 3rd of May. Again, the focal point is the man in the white shirt, I think you could easily say, and the dark background with the church and the town and in the distance. That's an example of subordination where we're not really supposed to look at the sky itself. It just creates a kind of balancing element for the focal point and the foreground. And here we have an interesting use of, I guess we're going to call this emphasis and subordination, where certain forms like Christ being carried down from the cross, that attracts our attention, but there are other elements in the painting in this altarpiece that draw our eye around. So look at this figure 8 here, where it shows schematically how we are drawn around this image. Notice the light colored faces, Christ's body. This creates a kind of figure 8 form to tell a kind of story or to help emphasize the story and make sure, despite the fact that we have a focal point in the center, we also have other areas of interest in this painting. So we have rhythm and repetition coming up. And so the question is, which principle of design is really at work here in this particular painting? We have the repetitious elements of the light colored faces creating kind of rhythm. We're moving around, but notice we have a number of principles of design at work in this painting because of the way it's constructed. Areas of subordination in the gold colored background, for instance. The drapery is not meant to attract too much attention, just to give the forms a kind of fluidity and solidity. So rhythm is based in repetition and is a basic part of our world. Visual rhythm depends on the repetition of accented elements, usually shapes. And here's an example. Paul Klee's landscape with yellow birds. We have repeating elements of I think this is supposed to be slivers of a moon, the vertical sort of grayish elements, although I'm not sure. And then we have birds scattered around the gouache. Gouache is a kind of watercolor, kind of an opaque watercolor. But We have repeating elements, and again, this draws our eye around the painting like the altarpiece that we just saw, but perhaps in a different way with more specific repetitions of very clearly defined and almost rhythmic elements, the vertical gray slivers. So wrapping up here, this brief little lecture of mine, we have the visual elements on the left, right? We have line, shape, mass and volume, perspective, space, texture and pattern, color, lighter tone. The asterisk items are found in Introduction to Art. The other items are often found in other textbooks or sources. The principles of design tend to be more sort of codified, I guess you could say. And they are, just to review, unity, variety, scale, proportion, balance, emphasis, subordination, movement, and rhythm and repetition. So I hope this helps. I would definitely read the examples in our textbook. My little presentation here is just intended to give you a kind of overview of the process. Good luck with your reading. Thank you.